Good afternoon. I'm Lucas Morel, professor of politics and head of the politics department here at Washington and Lee University. We're here to commemorate September 17th, Constitution Day, which marks the date when delegates to the Constitutional Convention of 1787 signed a new Constitution for the United States of America, which they hoped would replace the Articles of Confederation and Perpetual Union. To commemorate Constitution Day, the Politics Department has organized a panel to discuss an essay by Nikole Hannah-Jones, written for New York Times Magazine as part of their 1619 project. Complete with study guides, curricula, and resources to supplement more than 30 essays and artistic productions, it seeks, quote, to reframe the country's history, understanding 1619 as our true founding, end quote. To do this by placing slavery at the center of America's social and political development. 1619 is the year that 20 enslaved Africans arrived in Old Point Comfort, a coastal port near Jamestown in the British colony of Virginia. The 1619 Project describes its mission as placing the consequences of slavery and the contributions of Black Americans at the very center of the story we tell ourselves about who we are. Nikole Hannah-Jones wrote the lead essay for the project, and we chose her essay as our focus for Constitution Day because it raises important questions about how we understand our nation's past, its ideals, governing structures, and the actions of its diverse people, all of which shapes how we understand our Constitution. Let me now introduce our panelists in the order they will present their opening remarks, and then we look forward to evading your questions about this presentation and the 1619 Project. Brandon Hasbrouck is Assistant Professor of Law at Washington and Lee University. Robin LeBlanc is Professor of Politics and former head of the Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies program. Mohamed Kamara is Associate Professor of French and head of the Africana Studies program. I'm Lucas Morel, and I will follow Professor Kamara. And to close, we have Molly Michelmore, Associate Professor of History in the History Department. We wish we had her in politics. There we go. I almost gave you a promotion, too. She's Associate Professor of History and the Chair of the History Department. Let's begin with Professor Hasbrouck.
It is my pleasure to be with you all today. I want to thank Lucas for organizing this amazing panel, some of the brightest minds. I was instructed by Lucas that I had 7 minutes to provide brief remarks, and if I go a second over, he was going to go, quote, "Showtime at the Apollo" on me. So I will do my best. I want to spend my time discussing a question that I am left asking after reading Nikole Hannah-Jones' powerful and moving essay. What's free? Meek Mill and Jay-Z asked a specific question in their iconic hit properly entitled, What's Free? They asked this question several times during the hip-hop track while examining our criminal justice system. For example, Meek Mill raps, trying to fix the system in the way that they designed it. Jay-Z fires, 3/5 of a man, I believe, is the phrase. The 3/5 compromise shows us that white supremacy birthed, nurtured, and financed American democracy. White supremacy was reinforced during 250 years of bondage, and despite the addition of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, white supremacy was further reinforced during another century of Jim Crow and another 50 years through mass incarceration. Two of the most influential books about race in many years, The New Jim Crow, written by Michelle Alexander, and Between the World and Me, written by Ta-Nehisi Coates, address this precise issue. They both conclude that nothing is free in a criminal justice system that declared blacks public enemy number one. Indeed, as Coates argues, the black body is the clearest evidence that America is the work of men. This is hard to dispute. The criminal justice system was, to quote the late great Toni Morrison, built on the backs of blacks. All of these Fourth Amendment decisions involve black defendants, giving police officers the superpowers to racially profile, conduct pretextual stops, and to use excessive force. A significant part of the problem is that there are criminal laws such as these that increase police contacts with the black community. 4 quick observations. First, these are non-serious and decidedly vague laws. Second, poor people are more likely to find themselves committing several of these crimes than people who are not poor. For example, sleeping in a public place. Third, precisely because these crimes are non-serious or vague, police officers will have little difficulty establishing the requisite probable cause to justify arresting people for committing them. For example, if the law criminalizes jaywalking, the people regularly jaywalk. The question is not whether the police will have probable cause. They will, because many people jaywalk. Rather, the question is whether the police will use that probable cause selectively to arrest members of particular groups. For example, African Americans. Finally, even when officers do not arrest people for minor offenses, they may issue citations. Here is how this plays out every single day. It is worth repeating. This is how it plays out every single day. Here is a compelling schematic created by critical race theorist Devin Carbato. In my class, I would usually ask a question: what is the likely result with this police contact? For example, spitting in public. I would then engage my students Socratically to think through the answer. But I'm going to give you the answer. The answer is arrest. So I spit in public. If I comply with the police, I'll likely get cited or fined. There will be a court appearance. If I fail to appear, an arrest warrant will be issued and I will be arrested. If I do not appear and cannot pay the fine, I will either receive higher fines that I still cannot pay, which will lead to my arrest, or my license will be revoked. If I drive with a revoked license, I will be arrested. If I assert my rights, I will be arrested for failure to comply. Of course, the likely result of this police contact for many is incarceration, as many cannot afford bail. So what does all of this mean? Our criminal justice system punishes blackness. It was designed that way. To be black means to increase likelihood relative to whites to being stopped by police, searched by police, being killed during a routine police encounter, receiving longer prison sentences, and receiving the death sentence. 1 in 3 black men go to prison in their lifetime. Black women are 3 times more likely than white women to be incarcerated. And black boys are seen as guiltier than white boys. In addition, although there is no evidence that blacks are more likely to use or sell drugs, we are more likely to be arrested, charged, and convicted for those crimes. To be black means you are under constant police surveillance. So, I will end at the same point I begin by asking, what is free? It is time to create a criminal justice system that is precisely that, just. Imagine that. Until then, even in death, we all should be troubled. Thank you.
All right, can you hear me? Is it too loud, too scary? Might get that way. Not yet, okay. I don't have a slide, so I'll just speak from where I'm sitting. And the thing about this essay that really struck me from my perspective as a scholar, both of social movement and of gender and politics, was what I thought was Hannah-Jones's credible claim that in many, many ways, American democracy owes an enormous debt to the work done by Black Americans. And I'm going to start this way. A few years ago, in my sabbatical 2012-2013, when I went to Italy in an attempt to look at actually political engagement in urban spaces aimed toward the deepening of democracy. And one of the first things I had to do was a lot of paperwork and visits to local offices to get my permesso di soggiorno, my permit for stay for the year. And one of the first streets on which one of those offices was that I could go to was Via Martin Luther King. And it struck me then, and it strikes me now, that not just in the case of Martin Luther King Jr., though also including him, that there is something great, something huge, not just for the United States, but for the world in general, that comes out of the legacy of African Americans striving at enormous cost to be free and equal in our society. And I think that is, in general, a notion of powerful and dignified movement for justice and equality. And so I agree with Hannah-Jones that the pursuit of liberty and equality by African Americans has been essential to the extension of liberty and equality to all Americans. And I particularly feel that as a woman descended from slaveholders. I feel indebted to this work done on my behalf as well. Social movements need a whole variety of things to succeed, we theorists think, including resources and opportunities in political structures and what have you. But one of the things that's particularly important to social movement success is what we call a repertoire of tactics. That there are things out there that social movements can use to be recognized, that they can deliver a complex message pretty quickly. And Americans today rely upon an available repertoire of action that comes from us, not entirely, but to a huge degree, from the action of African Americans and from efforts to make African Americans free from slavery and then from the legacy of slavery. So we can think about movements to expand women's rights, as Hannah-Jones argues, that begin actually at the time of the abolitionist movement, a movement that is often taught as a movement of nice white people who wanted to free slaves, but also included, of course, very many active and risk-taking African Americans, including among them women. We can think about movements for LGBTQ rights, women's rights, all kinds of movements that have a very clear connection to African American activists, whether it's the two women such as Sojourner Truth or Charlotte Grimke, who are both abolitionist and suffragist, or later after the Civil War, someone like Ida B. Wells, who was active in challenging segregation with her own body, who was an early activist against lynching at great personal risk. But perhaps the most obvious and worldwide obvious legacy that I can mention in these short remarks would be the March on Washington during the Civil Rights era, which is now a standard part of most action to expand democratic experience in the United States and to expand access to fundamental rights. It's true, before King and others led the women's suffrage, the March on Washington, that the women's suffrage movement did have also a parade in Washington. But I think there was a big space in time between that and the March on Washington in the 1960s. And I think it's important to note that March on Washington, somewhat like the women's suffrage movement, but maybe even more effectively so, was situated as one of the peak moments in a very long and persistent effort at political movement, including persistent activist training, legal action, and where possible, electoral action. I particularly think, as a gender and politics scholar, of Rosa Parks on both two levels. One on the mythical level, that she was just like a sweet seamstress who just sat down because she was tired, endured arrest and sparked the Montgomery bus boycott, which is actually, though, a myth. A really, really incredibly and powerful story for young American women, more generally, but also of the way in which she models everything that is true about the civil rights movement and then becomes later important to social movement and to movement for equality and justice and many other cases. That she had activist training, that she was involved in the recruitment of fellow citizens to work with her, that she put probably her life on the line. She had a good reason to think she was doing that when she refused to accept a segregated position on the bus, that her work led to expanded protest in the community, and that she then, though many people don't know it, continued to live a life pursuing exactly those same things in places like Detroit at continued cost to herself. And these kinds of track tactics had a big influence on the women's movement, not only in the fact that through the Civil Rights Act, in some ways somewhat accidental, in other ways not, women, I'm here, that's why I'm here, because of Title VII and Title IX of the Civil Rights Act that have extended rights to women in educational places and in workforces. Those same kinds of tactics, using the legal system where possible, the electoral system, activist training, recruiting, and a march on Washington, particularly the 1993 March on Washington for Gay Rights, have been used to expand rights for the LGBTQIA+ community. Those are the same sort of tactics used again in the Women's March of 2017, or the Science March. We can think about the way in which there continues to be a harmony between the action of African Americans who are still at enormous cost to their lives, pressing for justice through the Black Lives Matter, and the connection of that to the March for Our Lives. And here I think I'll end on a personal note. Here in Lexington, I was one of a small group of people involved in the Care Rockbridge MLK Community Parade. And remember before the first parade, a lot of us were pretty scared because we were seeing pretty negative reactions, especially on the internet, to our action. And I remember the moment when I realized that that fear was the tiniest taste of what all of the Black Americans prior to me who were active to produce the repertoire under which we were about to organize a parade for our community had lived, and that, in fact, are still living. And we could say that my full expression of American citizenship, the full expression of the citizenship that I enjoyed in being an organizer of the MLK Parade here in Lexington, the full expression of the citizenship of a white female descendant of slaveholders is thus impossible without the work that has been done before me by Americans descended from enslaved Africans. And I mean, of course, the general material well-being that has tended to systematically accrue to those of us who descended from the slaveholder side of the equation. But I'm also referring, and this is really important, to my dependence on the citizenship work that has been done, the lives that have been risked and too often lost, so that I can realize full democracy. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm not as smart as Robin, so I'm going to be reading most of my remarks. And thank you all for being here. Thank you, Lucas, for the opportunity to be part of this panel. Why 400 years later are we still talking about slavery? It is not a mere academic or intellectual exercise. the delectation of a so-called effete ivory tower, as many would like folks to believe. We continue to talk about slavery even 154 years after the 13th Amendment, because the mentality that underwrote it is still alive in many quarters. We still do because 151 years after the adoption of the 14th Amendment, African Americans are yet to be accepted by many as full citizens of the country they helped make, according to Hannah-Jones, the richest and most powerful nation in the world. We still have to talk about slavery because 149 years after the 15th Amendment, many amongst us are still battling the indefatigable beast of disenfranchisement. We will continue to talk about slavery and its effects as long as we still have a socialization education model that fails or refuses to acknowledge its deficiencies and pitfalls, a model that continues to teach our white 4-year-old daughter that she cannot play with a black 4-year-old classmate because she is white and the other girl is black. This, to me, is the point of the 1619 project, and Nikole Hannah-Jones captures so eloquently in her banner piece. The shining city on the hill, the world's greatest democracy, cannot truly be great until it has found a way of including all of its citizens in its more than ample fold. The United States is a nation founded on both an ideal and a lie, says Nikole Hannah-Jones. In his famous 1852 July 4th celebration speech to the Rochester Ladies Anti-Slavery Society, What to the Slave is the 4th of July, Frederick Douglass pointed to the contradictions inherent in ideals of freedom, liberty, and equality on which the American Republic was founded. And I quote, "To drag a man in fetters into the grand illuminated temple of liberty and call upon him to join you in joyous anthems were inhuman mockery and sacrilegious irony. To him, your celebration is a sham, your denunciations of tyrants, brass-fronted impudence, your shouts of liberty and equality, hollow mockery," end of quote. Slavery, says Hannah-Jones, was a system so grotesque that Nazi Germany would later take inspiration from it for its own racist policies. A point made more poignantly by the eminent Franco-Martinican poet and public figure Aimé Césaire, when he noted that what the Western bourgeoisie, and I quote, "cannot forgive Hitler for is not crime in itself. The crime against man, it is not the humiliation of man as such, it is the crime against the white man, the humiliation of the white man." And the fact that he applied to Europe colonial procedures, which until then had been reserved exclusively for the Arabs of Algeria, the coolies of India, and the blacks of Africa, end of quote. This glaring hypocrisy could be traced, at least in part, back to the sordid underbelly of Enlightenment humanism. Even as they preached and fought for liberty, equality, and justice, the 18th century philosopher and their progenies on the other side of the Atlantic reinforced the idea, and I quote Hannah-Jones again, that black people were not merely enslaved, but were a slave race. Voltaire, the drum major of tolerance, writing in the halcyon days of the slave trade, offered several apologies for slavery and exoneration for its practitioners. For example, in his monumental essay on universal history, he complains, and I quote, "We are being reproached for slavery. A people that traffic in their own children are even more culpable than those that buy them. This trade proves our superiority, for he who allows himself to be governed is born to be," end of quote. And a character in one of his many short stories quipped, Our wise men have said that man is in the image of God. Behold an amusing image of the eternal being with a flat black nose, with little or no intelligence, end of quote. The fact that both the Atlantic slave trade and colonialism that followed it continued as they did led many commentators to criticize what Domhnall C. Stanton calls the blind spots and dramatic failures of Enlightenment humanism. M.A. Caesar called it pseudo-humanism for having, and I quote, a narrow and fragmentary, incomplete, and biased, and all things considered, sordidly racist conception of the human being. For his part, Claude Lévi-Strauss argued, and I quote, that all the tragedies we have lived through, first with colonialism, then with fascism, finally the concentration camps, were not in opposition to or in contradiction with so-called humanism in the form in which we have been practicing it for several centuries, but almost as its natural continuation, end of quote. This belief in the essential inferiority of blacks, says Hannah-Jones, became the root of endemic racism that we still cannot purge from this nation to this day. If black people could not ever be citizens, if they were a caste apart from all other humans, then they did not require the rights bestowed by the Constitution. And the we in the we the people was not a lie, end of quote. Black Americans have never been accepted by all Americans as full and complete citizens of this country, the same way Irish, Italian, English, and other European Americans have come to be, to the point where the distinction between what is American and what is Irish, Italian, or English is non-consequential. No wonder then that from the height of our Europeanness, some of us are still telling our fellow citizens of color to go back home while saying there are very fine people on both sides of the fight for dignity and justice. In his self-defense at his trial for impiety and corruption of the youth, Socrates presented himself to his accusers and fellow Athenians as a necessary annoyance, sanctioned by the divine. If you kill me, he told them, you will not easily find another like me. I am that gadfly which God has given the state. And all day long and in all places, I'm always fastening upon you, arousing and persuading and reproaching you, end of quote. Blacks may not be as arrogant as Socrates to believe they have been sanctioned by the divine. Nonetheless, as long as many of them and their persecuted Muslim and LGBTQ plus brothers and sisters, and their exploited, dispossessed, and abandoned white brothers and sisters do not have an equal seat at the table and a fair access to the benefits thereupon, they will continue to be a gadfly to this nation that still has so much to offer, even as they acknowledge there are many allies and the significant strides that have been made on the rough journey to freedom through dignity. Thank you.
The lead essay of the 1619 Project is an essay about visibility. It's about how we see America's founding, how we see Black Americans. What? It's not on? What?
It's on. Sorry.
Their role in this country's development, and ultimately how we see each other, both as fellow citizens and as fellow human beings. Ralph Ellison, the author of one of the greatest American novels, Invisible Man, called this moral perception, the perception of the wholeness of American life and the cost of its successes and its failures. I think that the good part of Hannah-Jones's essay is its Ellisonian part. As she tells it, she eventually recognized that her father's steadfast devotion to the United States, despite the racial bigotry he experienced, owed to his recognition of how much his country was the product of Black American blood, sweat, toil, and tears. To betray America would be to betray the many ways his Black American ancestors helped shape America's language, literature, and political and economic history. I believe Hannah-Jones's mistake was to interpret American history as a zero-sum story, where the recovered strivings of Black folk had to displace the recorded achievements of white folk, especially those we have been long taught to view as iconic representatives of the American way. What was needed was a more capacious revision of American history, one that incorporated the heroic participation and fealty, loyalty of Black Americans, while also wrestling with, more sympathetically, the challenge the founders faced in establishing a free society in a land long accustomed to racial slavery. Instead, on my reading, riddled with half-truths, overstatements, out-of-context quotations, and errors of fact and interpretation about the founding and Lincoln, her history distorts our past and actually works at cross purposes with her own argument that it was Black Americans who fought to make our ideals true. Had Hannah-Jones read the writings of slaveholders like Washington, Madison, Jefferson, she would have learned that they not only acknowledged slavery's injustice repeatedly, but also discussed the obstacles to immediate emancipation. The American founders were revolutionaries, to be sure, but prudence marked their efforts to establish national independence in light of the pre-existing institution of slavery in 13 diverse states. During the Revolutionary War and the early efforts to cement a union of the American states, the founders believed that they could not free themselves and their slaves at the same time, generally speaking. To insist on the latter as a condition for the former would have doomed the entire enterprise. For example, South Carolina and Georgia were land rich and, as they saw it, labor poor. And so they were hesitant to do anything too quickly to stem the flow of slaves into their states. To lose their support during the Revolutionary War, when only a united effort to throw off British rule promised any hope of success, would have made an already audacious enterprise much less likely to succeed. The essay, in my opinion, reflects a woeful ignorance of the writings of the founders. They always affirmed that all human beings possessed natural rights. The slaveholding founders were all too aware that the enslaved had legitimate grievances. As Jefferson put it, 10,000 recollections by the Blacks of the injuries they have sustained will divide us into parties, produce convulsions, will probably never end, but in the extermination of the one or the other race, quoting from Notes on the State of Virginia. Jefferson thought that emancipation would have to be followed soon by expatriation, what was called Black colonization, in order to give an incentive to whites, a fearful population of whites who knew that the Blacks who would rise up against them would be just in doing so. But the only way to give them any incentive to do so was to make it less likely that they would seek vengeance. And therefore, he thought the only way to do that was by expatriation. I turn to the ugly part of the essay, her account of Lincoln. Now she's on my turf. Someone audited my class. To complete her takedown of the founders, she, of course, has to take down their greatest defender, Abraham Lincoln. Hannah-Jones claims that Lincoln, quote, believed that free Black people were a troublesome presence, incompatible with the democracy intended only for white people, end quote. She omits or does not know that Lincoln was actually describing Kentucky senator and slaveholder Henry Clay. His opinion regarding the difficulty of having free Blacks and enslaved Blacks live in the same community. Lincoln did this in a eulogy to Henry Clay in 1852. when she asserts that anti-black racism runs in, quote, the very DNA of this country, end quote, and she cites Lincoln's presidency as yet another example of how this played out poorly for blacks in American history, she gives no credit to the president who did the most to preserve, protect, and defend, even to the point of war, the Constitution, and the kind of country that she acknowledges would be necessary to secure the rights of black Americans. No mention of Lincoln's vigorous critique of the very tawny opinion she criticizes in the immediately preceding paragraph, where Taney reads black people out of the Declaration and Lincoln says they belong in. No mention of the Gettysburg Address, which Lincoln delivered in the year of Jubilee, as I call it, the year where he proclaimed emancipation. And he challenged the nation to experience a new birth of freedom, which of course now would include 3 to 4 million black Americans. No mention of Lincoln's second inaugural address, an oration unsurpassed in its acknowledgement that slavery was a profound wrong committed by America towards her black inhabitants, and which he claimed the Almighty may very well have been rectifying by allowing a devastating civil war and yielding an emancipation neither side expected. That Hannah-Jones is unaware of or oblivious to Lincoln's efforts on behalf of black Americans, I believe muddles her attempt to view American history through the lens of black patriotism. Throughout American history, black Americans have needed the ideals and institutions, and yes, the people, which includes the vast white majority of the United States, to ensure progress in protecting their civil and political rights. Despite her claim that for the most part, black Americans fought back alone, that's her claim, for the most part, they fought back alone, they simply could not have done this without the help of a whole lot of white people. Let American history provide the lesson. So glad I've got Molly right at my hip to correct me. If the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendments required a black majority in Congress in order to pass, let alone be ratified by the states, how secure would the rights of black Americans have been then or since? How much political progress would the nation have made if color, not citizenship, if race and not humanity characterized our political practice over time? Surely the progress Americans have made on this front had everything to do with the principle of equality taking hold ever more and more over Americans, most of whom were white. So to assert that anti-black racism runs in our DNA is to turn a blind eye to the profound conviction of most white Americans that all men are created equal and deserve an equal opportunity at pursuing the American dream. Understood this way, one, I believe, is compelled to see not 1619, but 1776 as the legitimate origin of the meaning of America and the key driver of America's political development, which I read as one long civil rights movement. To close, if Americans lack a conviction about the essential goodness of the United States, a goodness she makes more difficult to see and understand, our political polarization will only get worse. The racial mindedness of the left and the right will keep Americans caught, to quote Ellison, between what they profess to believe and what they feel they can't do without. During our greatest crisis of national identity, the American Civil War, Lincoln and many fellow Americans, black and white, did their best to preserve what was right about the founding in the face of both misinterpretations and outright rejections of the nation's fathers. In the end, her essay, I believe, was a missed opportunity to help Americans understand our past better and therefore enable us to see and trust one another as fellow citizens of one common United States of America.
So I am tech dependent, but not particularly tech savvy, so this may take a moment. Let's see, I want to go to... Actually, I can do it without it. So I would like to thank everybody for coming out, and of course my distinguished panelists for giving us, I think, a lot of things to talk about. And I want to thank y'all for coming out to celebrate and talk about the Constitution and to talk about what I think is this extraordinary essay by Nikole Hannah-Jones, as well as a sort of extraordinary project in the doing of public history. And when I was asked to do this, I was sort of thinking about what I could contribute to this discussion. I'm not an expert on Lincoln. I'm not an expert on the founders. The 19th century sort of scares me. And so I was trying to think about what I could bring to this discussion. And luckily, a graffiti artist and Twitter came to my rescue over the weekend. When two monuments, statues to Robert E. Lee and to Stonewall Jackson, were tagged by graffiti artists. These monuments in Charlottesville are often the recipient of such political tagging. Indeed, these monuments to Confederate generals have been at the center of public controversy for some time now. But this weekend was a little bit different. Sprayed on the base of each statue was the date 1619. This so-called act of vandalism at once calls attention to the histories that we have memorialized in public spaces and to those that we have deliberately, I think, tried to forget. The 1619 Project is an attempt to do exactly this same thing. It is, an activist and author Nikole Hannah-Jones's words, quote, an attempt to set the record straight, to tell the truth about who we are as a people and who we are as a nation. It is time to stop hiding, she says, from our sins, to confront them, and in confronting them, it is time to make them right. The basic conceit, as we've all laid out here, is pretty straightforward. The story of America begins not in 1776, as Professor Morell would have it. It doesn't begin with the founding of Jamestown in 1607 or the signing of the Mayflower Compact in 1620, but rather with the arrival of some 20 to 30 African slaves in the colony of Virginia in 1619. Nothing about the next 400 years of history makes sense unless you begin the story there. It is also an attempt, I think, to put the enslaved and their descendants at the center of American history and to rescue their stories and contributions from the margin of American history and to restore them to their rightful place at the center. As is the case with all collections of essays, some contributions to this larger project were stronger than others. Wesley Morris's case that, quote, everybody is always stealing black music seems fairly unassailable. Kevin Cruz's argument that slavery can explain contemporary traffic patterns in Atlanta is maybe a little overstated, although certainly one cannot explain metropolitan development in the 20th century America without paying attention to residential segregation and to the forces, public and private alike, that have produced and maintained it. For historians, these are pretty familiar stories, right? These are narratives that we would probably have in an introductory history class, subject to some debate, subject to some modification and revision, but generally accepted as part of the American story. And yet, the 1619 Project as a whole has produced what I initially saw as a sort of surprising amount of backlash on social media and in other places. The Federalist, which is a conservative online publication, has decried the product not only as bad history, but as dangerous. Andrew Sullivan, writing in New York Magazine, Andrew Sullivan bills himself as sort of a heterodox conservative, sees this as evidence that the New York Times has abandoned liberal principles in favor of radical activism. These objections, as I said, sort of surprised me at first, but on reflection, they probably shouldn't have. And indeed, this kind of deliberate and willful ignorance of the past, this sort of willful forgetting, has long been part of the American story. That's not to say that there are not some good faith objections to certain parts of the 1619 Project. Centering African enslavement, of course, displaces First Nations in the history of the United States. African slavery did not begin in 1619, nor was it unique to the United States or what would become the United States or to the British colonies. The scope and nature of the relationship between capitalism and slavery, the center of one of perhaps the most controversial essays in the project, Matt Desmond's take on Ed Baptist's work on this, is an area hotly contested by historians, by economic historians, by historical economists, and others. But many of the objections, I think, on social media were not in good faith, but rather were knee-jerk reactions to the premise of the project itself. that Black people are central to American history, and that American history makes no sense without attention to slavery and its unraveling, that the legacies of slavery, political, economic, and cultural, are still very much with us. And I think that's interesting and something worth talking about as members of an academic and intellectual community, as people committed in one way or another to this teacher-scholar model. How do we get that story right? Professor Morell asked us to think specifically about the introductory essay to the 1619 Project, about Nikole Hannah-Jones's essay introducing the series, seeking to understand that love that her father had for a country that simply did not love him back. Hannah-Jones come to the conclusion, as we've said, that, quote, much of democracy, or as much democracy as this nation has today, has been born on the backs of Black resistance. For generations, we have believed in this country with a faith it did not deserve. Black people have seen the worst of America, and yet somehow we still believe in its best. And in reading this and in thinking about sort of how to close and how to open this up with conversation, I was reminded of James Baldwin. And James Baldwin's sort of note in The Fire Next Time, that what white America's crime was its innocence. And it's insistent on being innocent of this crime of slavery. And it seems to me that in some of the rejections, not all of them, but some of the rejections of this 1619 Project, that initial crime is compounded and continued. Thank you very much. Yes. So I'm going to field questions as soon as I get my mic on. Who wants to kick it off? Yes, Nick.
Hi, Professor. Okay. So I made the mistake of reading the conservative critiques of 1619 before I actually read the essay.
Never read the comments.
I know. It was my mistake. So I was a little surprised when I actually read the essay to find that the author never actually uses 1619 as the true founding of America. Rather, she says that the year 1619 is as important to the American story as 1776. Rather, it's just the New York Times' way of framing the project as a whole that uses some of the most radical language. So I found myself wondering, like, what actually are people so afraid of with this project? And so I was hoping I could ask what you think the practical social, political, and legal consequences are to reframing American history to focus on 1619.
So Nick's question for the historical record is, I think, A, what was the sort of freak out in the conservative media environment about? And what are the legal, cultural, social, political consequences of reframing our discussion of American history around 1619 as opposed to 1776?
Yeah, I mean, I understand why conservatives are not all on board with the project, so to speak. I'm just curious what you think the practical ramifications of the project will be.
Who would like to take this?
We're all very polite. We all have opinions.
I'll throw out a starter comment, and then hopefully some of these more articulate panel members will join in. To me, I think that I think the great value of her essay and the great value of the project from the perspective of the deepening of democracy, which is important to me, and from making the Constitution real. And I'll have to say that as a woman, I see that that Jefferson believed in the equality of all white men, and some might interpret that he hoped someday that would include all men, but I would note women were not there ever in that imagination. And I would say that her point is well taken, that democracy is something we have come to the extent we have it. And I would, point to Brandon's data that we don't entirely have it. But that if we go back to 1619 and we see that moment, and we see it more wholly, then we can really talk about the work we need to do, and we can really see that that the making of democracy is something very, very hard, that it has cost the lives of heroes we never recognized, that it probably will continue to cost heroes we still are not good at recognizing, and then we can begin to focus on a notion of democracy that's process-oriented, and that hopefully part of that process will be the creation of eyes to see who we are, that we will become more meaningful, ever more meaningful. And I think to the extent that it is richly meaningful, and that I have this diverse audience in front of me, and that I'm speaking these things, we owe an enormous debt to the work of incredibly brave African Americans who were willing to put those words to the test. And that's not to say that they were the only ones willing to do so, nor are they the only ones now willing to do so. But to see that process, to have eyes for the complexity of the project of making a we, I think is an enormous political possibility for us.
I'll address that question as well. The phrase used earlier was that it was dangerous and bad history. That's the conservative backlash. I would agree that it is bad history. And I've only pointed out a few examples of the bad history. I have a much longer essay that will surface at some point, Lord willing, this month, where I will mention more of what she gets incorrect. And that was the great disappointment for me in the essay, is that she had an opportunity to remind us of things that Ralph Ellison, Carter Woodson, Du Bois, who she does mention, have said decades ago about the contributions that have been made by blacks throughout this country's history, here before there was a here. That is eclipsed by shoddy scholarship, and I'm being generous here. I want to know how she doesn't know these fairly rudimentary things about Jefferson, Washington, Madison, and others. I want to know why she didn't bother to find the source of the quote that she attributes to Lincoln and doesn't know that he's actually describing Henry Clay. She wrote an essay that is over 7,000 words long, the lead essay for a joint project by the New York Times and the Pulitzer Center. She's a MacArthur Genius Fellow, so what she says matters. People, important and non-important, unimportant people are going to read it. She is going to shape the story of our past. And if you're going to do that, as we say, you got to come correct. And she didn't. She cherry-picked. She took quotes out of context. She told half-truths. And in shading it this way, she's a bad historian and makes it easier for people who want to hear this other message to say that's not an important message. So for me, my concern as a politics professor, that has a civic impact. Right now, our civics, our citizens need, fat chance, I hope not, in anticipation of an election next year, many elections next year, we need to be able to trust one another even as we disagree about where we're going. And her essay did not do a good enough job of reminding us of what we had in common. And it does make it easier for people to give her essay short shrift because they could point out, well, she made mistakes about here, and about this, and about that, and about the other. If she had done her history well, it would have been much more difficult for a conservative backlash to have the traction that it did. That was my disappointment with the essay. I was looking for something that I had seen several times before, puzzled why she doesn't quote Ralph Ellison in certain places where it seems like she's cribbing from a Time magazine article he wrote in 1970 called What America Would Be Like Without Blacks, where he talks about perfecting democracy, which is a phrase she uses. So I'm puzzled by that, troubled by that, given the resources that have gone behind this. If you go to, I'll try to wind this up, if you go to the resources part, the curriculum part, I'm like, okay, maybe there's where the juicy footnote primary sources are going to be found. And it's more polemical stuff. They don't tell you to go read Jefferson's troubling Notes on the State of Virginia, on laws, read that, query 14. On manners, which really should be called On Slavery, query 18. Go read that. Read his letter to John Holmes. Read his letter to John Adams, where he says, if we free slaves, we would be giving them freedom and a dagger. Whoa, what? What? A dagger? Why? Why do they think that? Okay. What do you mean, race war? You know, this is Alexis de Tocqueville, the most famous and most important and profound observer of American politics. Rights and democracy in America, precisely about these things. He didn't predict the Civil War, he predicted a race war, precisely about the things that she raises in her essay. So in short, had she done her history better, I think she would have done a better job educating the American citizenry and robbed the extremes of both right and left of ammunition, either for or against her project.
I think I'll only say, and I don't claim to be an expert on Jefferson or Madison or Lincoln, that I do think that your read on the essay as a whole is a little unfair, and that she doesn't actually posit a zero-sum trade-off between 1776 and 1619 as places when we can start the story. And indeed, right, it seems to me as if she is centering Black experiences as making real the promises of 1776. And so in suggesting, as you did in your remarks, that there is, in fact, a zero-sum story happening here is, I think, an unfair reading of what she's doing.
Yeah, I would agree with that, and I would push back a bit on Lucas's comments, because I don't know necessarily that was her goal in here was to tell a full historical account. Sure, her account may be selected, but I think the message and the point of this is clear. Our political, social, and legal structures need to be imagined, and constitutional norms can be established through the Black experience. And I think that's why she ends with this comment that we, meaning Black people, have always been the perfecters of this democracy. We've never been the problem, but the solution. So I think that is what the goal of this is to accomplish. I don't think necessarily to accomplish kind of commonality. In fact, I think finding common goals sometimes is something that is projected, especially in legal structures, through whiteness. Mm-hmm. And so for me, I think this is an important piece of literature to tell us that we could get to results and we could come up with solution. And the way to do it is looking at the Black experience.
Another question. Yes, sir.
Thank you for taking my question. One of the things that stood out to me in the first speech was what was said in terms of the legal system penalizes Blackness. And my question would be, if that's the case, then why is it that in places like Baltimore City, which is more or less where I'm from, where we have a Black mayor, a Black police chief, and a majority Black police force, why is that law still being enforced? If what you're saying is true, wouldn't those leaders in the Black community realize that and say, hey, we need to change the law?
So the question is, if, as Brandon has posited, that the legal system penalizes Blackness, how is it that in Black majority cities with Black political leadership, those laws are still in force?
Sure. So to step back in terms of what laws and kind of big picture, because there's a lot to unpack based on what your question, how you ask it. And my theory is that the criminal justice system does, in fact, punish Blackness. The way it does it is through the legal structures. For an example, as you mentioned, say Baltimore, Black mayor, how they could enforce it is just through everyday criminal laws. For an example, as I mentioned there, and there's a lot of laws on the book that require mandatory minimum sentences. So how prosecutors have used this with Blacks under this idea, probably right, that judges and juries are more often likely to convict Black people. So how this plays out is it plays out in the plea system. 97% of our cases are brought through plea agreement, and prosecutors know they have that advantage. Hey, you pleaded these crimes, or else you're going to face a jury that may convict you for this higher mandatory minimum. So when we look at statistics and how and what it tells us is that prosecutors, a paper that I'm exploring now, I think, are probably the main driver of this mass incarceration. It's not just about Baltimore. It's everywhere, right? And I think that is, the larger point. And I think we just need to reimagine, the truth is, how we look at the criminal justice system. And I think there's a lot of fixes that we could come into play if we do that through the Black lens.
Another question. Yes.
I have a question. In the essay, it states that anti-Black racism runs in the very DNA of this country. If it runs in the very DNA of this country, which by definition we cannot get rid of, how do we help to make racial progresses in a country that still has issues with race?
So the question is, if as Nikole Hannah-Jones suggests, that anti-Black racism runs in the DNA of the country, how do you essentially excise that strand of DNA, right, from the central makeup?
Just a brief comment is to follow up through structures. Our structures have to change. And I think, right, you could have a lot of Black people, mayor and council, but it's the structure, the legislative structure, the criminal statutes that are in place that absolutely have to change. And the way we think about, like, for example, criminal justice reform, I think we need to think about it differently.
Just briefly on that, I would say you don't want to push. She's using a biological metaphor there, but we don't have to be literalist about it, right? What she's trying to imply is this racism rests very deeply within us, and I think that that's just fundamentally true. Our failure to, as white people, to be able to see the Black lens, through a Black lens, to be able to see racism requires a sort of revolution in the way we think and live. Maybe it will take a very, very long time, but we have to be willing to accept a revolution in the way we see our position, I think, to begin to undo racist structures and to begin to undo the unseeing of people who are not white. And so I think she's suggesting it's very, very deep, and we need to look deeply, and we need to be committed with a kind of revolutionary fervor to our values that Professor Morell is rightly fond of. We have some beautiful values, but we need revolutionary fervor to pursue them as truths.
And of course, it's a metaphorical statement, of course. The focus is on systemic racism, and which goes back to the question you asked about Baltimore, for example, and why a city that is led by predominantly Black officials still cannot resolve the problem of mass incarceration of Blacks. It's because they operate within a system that has been in existence for a long time. And we know the history of the United States, and we know it is not a linear history in so many ways. And we know what happened during the Reconstruction period and what happened after the so-called Great Nadir period, and where we had a lot of effort after a period of about 8 years, which is the central focus of Ta-Nehisi Coates' book. We were 8 years in power, that Blacks gained access to offices, to representation in the legislature, et cetera, and were about to make changes, and made changes that affected not only Blacks, but also poor whites in many southern states. And we know what happened immediately after that, especially from the period that ran 8 years after 1866, from, let's say, 1877, all the way to the Great Migration and the setbacks that took place, and of course, during the Jim Crow Society, laws that were put back in place that disenfranchised Black. So they moved from a position where in many communities in many of the southern states, they held important positions of authority where they could make meaningful change in the way the societies operated, to going back to where they were before Reconstruction. And of course, the reason we had the civil rights movement of the 50s and 60s is precisely because of a recognition of that post-Reconstruction history. And so the idea of racism being present, if you will, as a DNA in the American system, of course, should be understood from a metaphorical perspective. but also as a historical reality. But of course, we know now, even in technology, in modern science, we talk about the possibility of changing DNA, making something better or worse. And when it comes to human societies and the creation of human societies, there's always the possibility of engineering society and re-engineering society for better or for worse for the majority of the people, or a small minority of that particular group of people.
Yes.
So my question, it could be seen as a bit of a tangent, but I think it gets to some of the central issues of narrative and national unity. So I'm thinking back to how we teach these stories to our children, the next generation. So when I was growing up, I remember, and I grew up in a very liberal area, but still I remember singing these odes to Christopher Columbus about how such a wonderful man he was. And when I think back to that, I'm a little kind of, at the very least, uncomfortable, because now I know some of the ugly truths, which is that he was responsible for terrible genocides, which by many accounts are genocide. So I think back as child me singing these odes, and I like it. At the same time, I think about if they told me Christopher Columbus, he was a genocidal maniac. Maybe that's true, but I don't know what that would have done to me as a child. I think I would have grown up with a deep hatred of my country. I don't know what that would have done. So the question is, how do you teach children these ugly truths, and yet at the same time not make them hate history?
So the question is, how do we teach our children ugly truths about the country's founding, ugly truths about Native American genocide, about slavery and its sort of significance to American history, without making them hate us and hate the country? Is that?
I mean, it's a little strong. Without feeling deep shame. I mean,
Yeah.
there should be some shame without just always going around being like, I just am upset about this.
I mean, and I think that's a really good question, and I can sort of, as a teacher, I'm always suggesting extra reading. So the Washington Post is actually doing a really interesting series on the teaching of slavery in K through 12 education, and essentially it found out that it's terrible, right? That the sort of traditional ways in which the history of American slavery has been taught to public school students has not sort of gotten at the real story there, right? There was something going around on social media about a teacher in Kansas asking her fourth grade students to do a reenactment of a slave market, right? Which is clearly a traumatic experience and a really bad idea, right? But I don't think that she or he was alone in doing this kind of lesson planning for how you teach these stories. And I have no idea how to teach children anything. Ask my 6-year-old. But I do think that that is a question that we're going to need to sort of get at, right? So that we can figure out how to integrate what I think is a really critical story. And in some ways, I think pushing the narrative back to 1619 actually makes those values that are written down in the Declaration all the more important, right? Because they are a process, right? There's a process of redeeming, of living up to those ideals, and sort of stressing the difficulty in achieving that is, I think, important. But how we, restructure K through 12 curricula to do so, don't ask me.
Great question. Thank you very much for that. We moved to Virginia almost 19 years ago. And one day I picked my daughter up from school. She was 4 years old. So the reference to the 4-year-old girls that I made in my presentation, and there was a huge cloud over her face. And I asked her what was wrong. It took a while. I was able to convince her to answer my question. And she said, well, the girls in my class wouldn't play with me. She was 4 years old. And I asked why. They said, because I am black. And the first thing I did, the next morning I went to the school, to the daycare at the basement of the Grace Episcopal Church. And I spoke with the head of the school, and I said, I just want to make one thing clear, that there are 2 victims here. The girl who is ganging up against my daughter and my daughter. And I said, because if you go back and you investigate this girl, 4-year-old girl, is getting it from somewhere. No child is born a racist. We are socialized or educated to be one. And lo and behold, we found out that the dad constantly spewed racist rhetoric in front of his children. And a couple of weeks after that, my son was playing soccer at the end of 60 West, the old Bellevue School? Yes. Mm-hmm. And I went to the old general store that was there, and there was this little kid, completely naked, about 3 years old boy, who was the son of the owners of the store, and he came running to me, "Uncle, uncle, uncle." And I was looking at this white kid, running to this black man, calling him uncle. What is going on? And of course, I thought about it. I said, even yesterday I was talking about it, several years later, what happened to that child? I would like to know if he would still call me uncle so innocently as he did back. The story of humankind is the story of what we do to our children. And the way we teach our children, deliberately or otherwise, will over 99% of the time be what they become eventually. And if we, and again, this idea of the DNA, right? If we tweak our education system, and when I say education, I'm also talking about the informal education that takes place in the home. And we have to be deliberate about it. We cannot assume that these children will become good people, even though we may be all born with goodness in us. We have to make the deliberate effort, if you will, to socialize our children to understand that they are neither inferior nor superior to anyone else.
Yes.
This goes back to the mandatory minimum prison sentences and systemic racism. If these institutions that have systemic racism are held up by the laws, why haven't we changed the laws to kind of lessen the systemic racism or get rid of it totally? And it may not be as clear-cut as that, but why haven't we taken like specific measures to look at our laws and be like, these are keeping these things in place that are bad, that have been here forever? Why don't we repeal those laws and create new ones that are more just?
Yeah,
So I think I'm supposed to repeat the question. So the question is, given relatively convincing evidence that mandatory minimums and other kinds of laws have racially disparate effects, why haven't we moved to get rid of them?
Well, I can tell you this, we're working on it, right? There's activists every day in every state working on to repeal mandatory minimums, to expunge records, and some are arguing also that we need to abolish prisons, especially for folks that are serving sentences, long sentences, sometimes life sentences without the possibility of parole, for nonviolent drug offenses. So the work's being done, and it's not only being done in the criminal front, it's being done in the civil context too. I have to give a shout out to my colleague who's in here, Wendy Green's doing it, for example, with hearing discrimination, right? And we're identifying laws and we're trying our level best to address what the best outcome is. And I think, in my opinion, based on my assessment with criminal justice reform, I think the way to go about it is what this article suggests, is looking at it through a black lens.
I would just, completely agreeing with all of that, just add to the fact that if we look at, and this is a story also connected to the Baltimore story, if we look at the American political system as a whole, a small minority, and that is straight white men, have an overwhelming share of the positions in elected office. They have an overwhelming share of positions of power in political parties, an overwhelming share of power, positions of economic power. And until we see that and we admit that we are governed in what we think of as the world's greatest democracy by a minority that was once protected and arguably is still protected by the exertion of force against others unlike them, until we admit that, we can't actually begin to organize as fully as we need to take down those systems, right? And that means that it's a minority, that the majority of Americans, for various reasons, are not participating in representing themselves. They're not the ones making the decisions that affect their daily lives. They are not dominating the conversations about our priorities. We are not yet a democracy in the full sense of the word. We aspire to be a democracy. And one of the beauties of Hannah-Jones's article is she asks us to take the case of Black Americans, look it in the eye, and see, and then if you just turn that light on the system as a whole, you go, wow, we are still ruled by a small minority. There's work to do.
I think, too, that we might want to think about sort of other interests, whether they be economic or political, that are served by this sort of criminal justice system. And I study tax politics, and there is an argument to be made that criminal justice, or that particularly the policing of these small infractions, whether it be jaywalking or some drug possession, is in fact a way of raising money for fiscally strapped, financially strapped communities, right? And that, of course, is also a racial story. Because one of the reasons why urban areas are fiscally, financially strapped is because of white flight. White flight has diminished the property values in a lot of urban areas, which has made it difficult to raise money to pay for stuff, right? So one of the things you can do in the context of a diminishing property tax base, in the context of an anti-tax politics, which really begins to take hold in the 1970s and 1980s, is to raise some amount of money by fining people, right? And then by fining them again if they can't pay the fines, and sort of extracting resources from them that way. And so, there are ways in which the sort of interest in preserving these systems, right, which punish blackness, also serve other political and economic interests. So it's, it's like a knock-on effect. It's not necessarily, I want to be racist, so I'm going to pass these policies, right? There are other interests that are embedded in preserving and maintaining those kind of systems and institutions. One more question, I think. Oh, crap, maybe two. In the back.
So this is from the gentleman on the far left. You said that, correct me if I'm wrong, you said that if her main focus was not for the straight factual information, it wasn't a straight factual information essay, but more on about Black experience. And so, in your mind, do you think it's fair for her to downplay the white leaders, say Jefferson and Lincoln, and by not mentioning the whole of this historical information, and maybe by obscuring the deeds they did for African Americans? So, do you think it was fair for her to downplay the deeds or the white leaders?
So the question is, was it fair for Nikole Hannah-Jones to underplay, to downplay, to ignore the contributions of white leaders, including Jefferson and Lincoln? And I think this is for Brandon. I don't think anyone described Lucas as on the far left.
I gotta put my mic on for this.
I'm gonna.
Stage left. Stage left.
So, do I think it's fair? Absolutely. That's my response. I think it's a narrative that she's telling that I think is an important one. And if we, if she wanted to tell the historical account in full, right, it may tell a story that concludes where a lot of these other stories conclude, and that is to celebrate whiteness. I don't think that was her goal here. And I think her narrative, I think it's important to understand what the goal of this project is. And so for me, I think it's absolutely fine that she did that.
So I would like to give Lucas a chance to respond here.
Thank you. She could have done that without taking Lincoln down, without linking him with Taney, the author of the most notorious Supreme Court case ever in American history. She could have done it without hitting Jefferson in the most obvious way, without explaining that actually Jefferson, in spite of his own personal failing to try to get out of debt so that he could afford to free his slaves, without giving that sort of context, she just cherry-picked from Jefferson. We didn't need that essay to tell us that about Jefferson. That's old news. So the fact that she gave us bad history about white involvement in American political progress. She felt that that was necessary. When you're a writer, you have choices. You have choices about what goes in and what you leave out. Great artists are the best at this. They choose what to leave out. And again, this is where I wonder, is she just a bad historian, or is she a disingenuous one? Does she know the history and deliberately left it out for readers who don't have the resources to go to the library, to search intelligently on the internet? The greatest thing about her essay, aside from the Black contribution point that she makes, is that now readers are going to go, I hope, read more Lincoln. And they're going to, I think, come to the same conclusion that I did. Why did she leave this out? Why did she leave this out? And more importantly, why did she put this part about Lincoln in and leave all the rest of it out, as if it's to say, well, what you were taught about Lincoln is he's the great emancipator, but let me tell you this, he wasn't really interested in the well-being of black people. Because I'm going to mention this one episode that happened one time during his presidential tenure as he was getting ready to emancipate slaves. Okay, and then she makes some other reference to a quote of his from 1858, where he's quoting himself from 1854. But anyway, the fact that she chose specifically isolated incidences about white people, search in vain in this over 7,000-word essay for the props that she gives for the co-laborers in the effort, in the way that King always did. The most famous button from the I Have a Dream speech is what? Black and white hands gripped like that. What's one of the most famous civil rights songs? We Shall Overcome. What is one of the lines? Black and white together. Okay. King recognized that mainstream political progress in this country had to happen with the aid and assistance and goodwill of whom? A majority of white people. 1954, Brown v. Board of Education had how many black Supreme Court justices? 0. The 1964 Civil Rights Act was passed by how many U.S. senators who were black? 0. The 1965 Voting Rights Act was passed by how many black senators? 0. And precious few black representatives. Even more so, 13th, 14th, 15th Amendment, I could go on, right? So even the fact, and what astounds me is not so much that Jefferson could say all men are created equal and turn around and own slaves. What astounds me is that a man who owned slaves decided that to make his own freedom secure, he had to do it on what basis? Not anything you're going to find in a secession ordinance or the Confederate Constitution. To make his own freedom secure, because after all, they were declaring something that wasn't true for them yet, which is their own freedom. He had to find a basis in his humanity, something he never said or wrote did not apply to black people. Letter to John Holmes, 1820, during the Missouri Compromise crisis, what does he say? We have the wolf by the ear. We can neither hold on to him nor let him go. He was saying, in the scales of justice, we have justice on the one hand and self-preservation on the other. Justice for whom? The enslaved. He says they deserve their freedom. Why aren't they getting it in the United States? Because whites are fearful that on the top of the to-do list is kill massa after they are freed. That's why. That's the conundrum he was in. I'm not saying this to justify Jefferson's enslavement of over his period of time. What I'm saying is, if you read the history, you will see that they actually anguished and struggled over how do we make progress in freedom in a country where these lingering unfree practices, mores, norms, and customs still exist. Right? The whole debate between Du Bois and Booker T. Washington, which is decades after the failure of Reconstruction, right, is all about this question. How do we deal with a people schooled in over 200 years of racial prejudice? That's the way Booker T. Washington put it. He had one approach. Du Bois said, no, there's a different way. So for me, the selectivity of what she chose to render as the white portion of our American history is a disservice to history.
Just a quick response, because I know we're running out of time, but I do want to, I think Lucas's point is, what is the goal of this essay? He thinks that part of the goal may be you read it and you decide you want to look up more history about Jefferson. And you may find this, that Jefferson was not what she represented. Alternatively, how I read it is, I think it's going to tell the reader to critically examine our structures, interrogate, and if you see a problem, to act. And I think that's what it is. The way I think Lucas wanted it written, it sounds like a bit, and I understand an even hand, but it's to be another celebratory account of whiteness.
Yeah.
And to be completely frank, that is 95% of literature out there.
Yeah.
That is the problem with K through 12. That is why, to finish this point up, when I discuss these issues with my daughters, we read A is for activism. We read I Am Rosa Parks. We read intersectionality. This is what we teach our children, right? Because I want my daughters to question, to interrogate, to read something and not be whitewashed. I want them to know and to critically examine every structure and system that is in place. And I hope that's what they do. And I think an essay like this tells us that's what we all should be doing.
And I just want to add two things. One, I'm not sure that white men, Jefferson, Lincoln, need more props in the historical literature, right? So there is a sort of correction happening here. I think the other thing, right, and this is sort of getting to King, is that he also understood, right, and he writes this in the letter from a Birmingham jail, that people in power never give it up until you ask them to, until you make them, right? And so that is, right, that it is always a struggle, and that struggle begins at the grassroots, right, in the black community, that those white senators and congressmen and LBJ, right, who signs the Civil Rights Act, who signs the Voting Rights Act, they would not have done so unless they were forced by activism coming up from the grassroots, from the black community, right? They didn't just get woke one day and you're like, you know what? We should really pass the Civil Rights Act. That was a response to political pressure, to organizing, to activism from within the black community. So I think we have time for one more question. Right there.
Okay, so how does the release of 1619 and the history it contains affect our campus and its future? And how can we use it to like better or improve the culture here on campus?
That's a good question. I'll defer.
Could you?
Oh, the question is, how does the 1619 project as a whole affect WNL? How does it affect the way we understand our history? And how does it affect the ways that we think about and can improve campus climate?
So I'll jump in just by virtue of the fact that I've been here longer than anybody else in the panel, and hopefully be very brief. I think that like this is a campus that worships like a white guy who had slaves, who fought to keep slaves, or as I say, he's sort of like Saigo Takamori. He's from the South. He was a traitor and a loser in the 19th century. But that is really important element of our history. And I think that to the extent that we aren't willing to sort of interrogate the fact that our traditions also, some of which can be really lovely, are also have this tendency to reinforce this notion that the projects of white people are the inherent, natural, objective, neutral projects, and everybody should just make themselves fit that. I think that's a problem for our community. It's a problem even for white people in our community because it means that we are not opening ourselves to what we can be now and in the future. And what I'd really like to believe about even our, white male founder guys is that they would rise to the challenges of a new and better America or a new and better Washington and Lee. And so I think we could use the 1619 project and discussions around it to say how much better, how much richer, how much more thrilling would this campus be if we just said, look, whiteness is a problem for us and it's getting in the way, it is literally blinding us to some of the other things here already in our community, some of the other people, the ideas, the ways of thinking. We could be richer intellectually. We could be richer as a community. Our lovely idea of civility could be a more real civility if we would just say, that whiteness is just blinding us.
So, well, charity ends at home, doesn't always begin at home. But the history, as we talked about in the 2 chapters we read for the community discussion for our first-year students, that the history of WNL runs parallel in so many ways to the history of the United States. And Barack Obama said constantly that America will always end up doing the right thing, even though not willingly, after a lot of struggle. And today we're here, we are talking about what we are talking about on this stage, black men, women. It was not always like that, but after several years of struggle and alliances that were formed between blacks and others, between women and others, Washington is a co-educational institution today, and a place where we have black professors, not only students. And so it is possible to look, of course, at the long history of America and put that template, of course, over the history of Washington and Lee. So ultimately, good gets achieved, and sometimes we take steps backward. But the reason the struggle continues is because there's always the hope that people will end up doing the right thing. And there's still a lot of progress to make. That is why we talk about a more perfect union. Otherwise, we just talk about a union. But we all have to recognize that the same way the United States is still not perfect, Washington and Lee is not. But it has moved in so many ways in the right direction.
All right, thank you so much for coming out. Happy Constitution Day.
Thank you, guys.